If someone had told me a year ago that the loudest, most disruptive force in my life would become its quiet center, I would have laughed. A dry, humorless sound, the kind that only comes from a man who has curated his solitude with the meticulous care of a museum archivist. My life was a collection of silences, each one catalogued and placed just so. And then came Cole. He was my neighbor, not by choice, of course. The small plot of land next to my cabin, a buffer of green the first had always considered part of my own extended wilderness, was sold. And onto it he arrived. He arrived with a truck that roared like a wounded beast, a toolbox that clanged with the discord of a fallen orchestra, and a presence that seemed to physically compress the air around him. I watched him from my study window, the one that overlooked the property line. I watched him for months. He was a man built of broad planes and solid angles, perpetually in motion. He was always fixing something, building something, tearing something down. He moved with an economy of motion that was both efficient and, to my reluctant eye, strangely beautiful. His existence was an affront to my stillness. My routine was my religion. Coffee at 6, writing from 7 until noon, a simple lunch, a walk through the woods behind my cabin, then reading and research until dusk. It was a life I had built as a fortress against the unpredictability of other people. A fortress whose walls, I was beginning to realize, were made of glass. And I was the only one who couldn't see out. Cole, I learned his name from a mailbox he hammered into the ground one Saturday, was my polar opposite. He seemed to thrive on noise, on effort, on the sweat that plastered his dark hair to his temples in the summer heat. He was a physical fact, undeniable and loud. I, on the other hand, was a collection of theories and footnotes, bound in tweed and quiet desperation. The distance between us was more than the 100 yards of grass and wildflowers. It was a chasm between two ways of being. He was the body, I was the mind. He was the roaring engine, I was the silent page. I felt a strange, infuriating pull toward him, the way a moth might feel toward a blowtorch. It was a fascination born of equal parts envy and irritation. He lived in his skin so effortlessly, while I felt like a poorly assembled costume I could never quite take off. Our interactions were minimal, clipped exchanges over the low stone wall that separated our driveways. A nod, a tight-lipped morning, he seemed to regard me with a kind of amused indifference, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if he found my entire existence a quaint, harmless joke. I resented it. I resented him. I resented the way my heart would perform a frantic little stutter step in my chest whenever he happened to look my way. And so the seasons turned, my silent observation and his loud existence running on parallel tracks that I was certain would never, ever meet. I filled my notebooks with words, and he filled the air with the scent of sawdust and gasoline. We were a contradiction, a paradox living side by side, and I was content, or so I told myself, to leave it that way. Forever. Then came the storm. It wasn't just a storm. It was a meteorological tantrum. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple-gray, and the wind began to howl, not like a voice, but like a physical entity trying to tear the world apart. I sat in my study, watching the pines bend at impossible angles, my carefully constructed piece unraveling with each gust. The power went out first, with a flicker and a sigh. My laptop battery would only last so long. The hum of the refrigerator died, leaving a silence that was heavier, more ominous than my usual quiet. Then came a sound, a great, groaning crack that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, followed by a deafening crash that shook my little cabin to its foundations. I froze, my hand hovering over my keyboard. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The storm held its breath, and so did I. Slowly, I rose and went to the living room window. And I saw it. A massive oak, one of the ancient sentinels of my property, had fallen. It had crashed directly onto the corner of my roof, its heavy branches spearing through shingles and timber like a prehistoric spear. Rain was already beginning to drip through the newly formed hole in my ceiling, a slow, methodical torture. A puddle was forming on my hardwood floor. My fortress had been breached. I was, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly helpless. I stood there for a long time, just watching the water drip, my mind a blank slate of panic. I had no generator. My cell phone had no service. The road would be blocked. I was trapped, my solitude suddenly transforming from a comfort into a cage. That's when I saw the beam of a flashlight cutting through the deluge, moving steadily toward my front door. It was a bright, determined light in the churning dark. A moment later, a fist hammered on my door, a solid, insistent sound that was impossible to ignore. I opened it, and there he was, Cole. He was soaked, rain streaming from his hair and down his face. He was wearing a heavy-duty rain slicker, and in the bobbing light of his flashlight, he looked like some mythic figure, a sailor come to rescue a drowning man. "You okay in here?" His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the wind. I could only nod, my own voice having abandoned me. He shone the light past me, into the living room, his eyes finding the puddle on the floor, and then tracing the path of the water up to the ceiling. He let out a low whistle. "Figured that was you." Sounded like the whole world was coming down. He met my eyes, and for the first time, the amusement was gone. In its place was a straightforward, uncomplicated concern. "You can't stay here. It's not safe. The whole structure could be compromised." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that I had it under control, a lie so transparent it was laughable. But the words wouldn't form. My control was a puddle on the floor. "Grab a bag," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Close for a couple of days. Whatever you need. You're staying with me until we can get this sorted." He didn't wait for an answer. He just stood there, a solid, immovable point in the chaos, waiting for me to comply. And for the first time since he had moved in, I was grateful for his noise, for his decisiveness, for his sheer, overwhelming presence. I was being rescued, and the most frightening part was the wave of relief that washed over me. His house was the opposite of mine. Where mine was filled with books and quiet corners, his was a space of open plans and practical surfaces. A massive workbench dominated one wall of the main room, covered in tools and blueprints. The whole place smelled of pine and coffee and something else, something that was just him. It was warm, dry, and safe. He handed me a towel. "Bathroom's down the hall. Get out of those wet things." "I'll make some coffee." I did as I was told, moving through his space like a ghost. In the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked pale, haunted, a refugee in my own life. I dried myself off and changed into the clothes I'd hastily thrown into a bag. When I came out, he was in the kitchen, and the sound of a generator rumbled from somewhere outside, a steady, reassuring heartbeat. The lights were on. He had already started a fire in the wood-burning stove, and the room was filled with a flickering, orange glow. The space, which should have felt alien, felt impossibly welcoming. He was moving around the kitchen with that same efficient grace I'd observed from my window, his broad back to me as he worked. Now up close I could see things my window had hidden. The faded tracery of a scar that disappeared into his hairline above his right temple. The way the muscles in his shoulders and back shifted under his simple gray t-shirt. The sheer, solid reality of him was overwhelming. My observations were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, sensory, and terrifying. He turned, a steaming mug in each hand. "Here," he said, holding one out to me. I reached for it, my fingers clumsy and cold. As I took the mug, my knuckles brushed against the back of his hand. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt, pure and electric, shot up my arm. His skin was warm, calloused, real. The contact lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. My breath hitched in my throat. Did he feel that? The thought was a flare of panic in my mind. He pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He didn't say anything, just gestured with his own mug toward one of the two worn leather armchairs near the stove. "Seat. Warm up?" I sank into the chair, the leather sighing under my weight. The ceramic mug was a warm anchor in my trembling hands. I watched him as he took the other chair, the space between us charged with a new, unspoken tension. The storm raged outside, but the real tempest was inside me, a whirlwind of fear and a strange, unfamiliar flutter of hope. For a long time, we just sat there, listening to the fire crackle and the wind scream. The silence in his house was different from my own. His was a comfortable silence, lived in. Mine was a curated, brittle thing. "That oak," I said finally, my voice sounding rusty to my own ears. "It was older than my cabin. Older than anything around here. Probably." He nodded, staring into the flames. "It's a shame, but it's just a tree. The house can be fixed. You're safe." That's what matters. His pragmatism was both frustrating and deeply comforting. He saw a problem and a solution. I saw a metaphor for my own ruined sanctuary. Later, he showed me to the guest room. It was sparse but clean, dominated by a large bed with a simple quilt. "It's not much," he said, standing in the doorway. "But the bed is comfortable. Holler if you need anything." I lay in that bed for hours, wide awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his house. The groan of the floorboards as he moved around, the click of a light switch, the eventual, deeper silence that meant he had gone to sleep. I was acutely aware of him, just one wall away. A man I had held at a distance for months was now the only thing separating me from the storm, both outside and in. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun was trying to break through the clouds. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. Cole was already outside when I woke up, a chainsaw roaring to life. I watched him from the kitchen window as I drank the coffee he'd left for me. He was clearing the smaller branches from the trunk of the fallen oak, his movements precise and powerful. He wore a pair of faded jeans and a dark Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong, corded forearms. The day grew warmer than expected, the post-storm humidity thick and cloying. Around midday, he stopped working and came back toward his house, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He stopped at the porch steps, right in my line of sight, and pulled his Henley over his head in one smooth motion. And I just stopped, my breath caught in my chest. It felt like the air had been vacuumed from my lungs. His back was to me, a landscape of taut muscle, sun-darkened skin, and a constellation of small, faded scars that told stories I couldn't begin to guess. A long, thin white line ran diagonally from his left shoulder blade toward his spine. I saw the way his muscles contracted and relaxed as he stretched, reaching his arms over his head. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing I had ever seen. It wasn't a performance. It was just a man, hot from his work, seeking a moment of relief. It was honest, self-conscious, and it undid me completely. My carefully constructed walls of intellectual distance, of annoyance, of superiority, they didn't just crack. They crumbled into dust. What was left was a raw, aching longing that was so intense it felt like a physical pain in my chest. This man was not an annoyance. He was a force of nature, just like the storm that had thrown us together. He turned then, and I ducked back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. My face was hot, flushed with a mixture of shame and something else, something I refused to name. He came inside, his bare torso gleaming with a light sheen of sweat. He didn't seem to notice my flustered state, just grabbed a water bottle from the fridge and drank deeply. "Making progress," he said, his voice a little rough. "Should have the main trunk off your roof by this afternoon. Then we could get a tarp over it properly." I needed to say something, anything, to prove I was a functioning human being. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The words sounded feeble, inadequate. He glanced at me, then at my soft hands, my bookish frame. A ghost of his old, amused smile touched his lips, but it was kinder this time. "Nah, I've got it. But you could keep the coffee coming. That would help." It was a small thing, but it was something, a task, a purpose. I felt a ridiculous surge of gratitude. "Of course," I said, maybe a little too quickly. While he worked, I found his first aid kit. My excuse was that he might need it. The truth was, I needed to feel useful. I organized it, checking the supplies, my hands moving with a nervous energy. It was while I was doing this that I heard him swear, a sharp, bitten-off curse from outside. I rushed to the door. He was standing there, shaking his head, his left hand held tightly in his right. "What is it? What happened?" "Nothing. It's stupid," he grumbled, his jaw tight. "Damn splinter. But it's deep here." This was it. A shift, a small reversal of our roles. He was the capable one, the rescuer. But in this tiny moment, he was the one who needed help. "Come inside," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let me look at it." He hesitated, a flicker of something. Pride? Reluctance? In his eyes. But then he sighed and followed me to the kitchen table, sitting down with a weary groan. He held out his hand. His palm was a map of his life. Calloused, crisscrossed with faint white lines. The splinter was angry and dark, buried deep in the fleshy part below his thumb. "I have tweezers," I said, my voice quiet. "An antiseptic. From your kit." He just nodded, watching me. I retrieved the items, my own hand surprisingly steady. I sat down opposite him, the table between us feeling both too wide and not wide enough. I took his hand in mine. His skin was rough against my softer palm. His hand was so much larger than mine, warm and solid. I could feel the faint, steady thrum of his pulse beneath my thumb. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The scent of sawdust, sweat, and rain-soaked earth filled my senses. "This might hurt," I murmured, my focus entirely on the delicate operation. "I'll live," he said, his voice a low rumble. I worked carefully, my breath held tight in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me, on my face, on my hands. The intimacy of the moment was staggering. I was touching him, willingly. I was caring for him. The power dynamic, which had been so skewed, had found a momentary, fragile equilibrium. I was no longer just a helpless academic. I was the one with the steady hand. I finally managed to grasp the end of the splinter and pulled. It came out clean. He hissed softly through his teeth, but didn't pull his hand away. I cleaned the small wound carefully, my touch as gentle as I could make it. His hand remained in mine, resting there, even after I was finished. I looked up and my eyes met his. The air grew thick, heavy. The usual humor in his gaze was gone, replaced by something deeper, more serious, something questioning. He was looking at me, really looking at me, for the first time. And I was looking back, my own carefully guarded interior exposed. He didn't pull his hand away, and I didn't let go. We just sat there, in the quiet of his kitchen, our hands linked over the table, while the world outside began the slow process of putting itself back together. And inside, something new, something terrifying and beautiful, was beginning to break apart. That night, the storm was gone, but a different kind of electricity crackled in the air between us. After a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, the only things I'd managed to contribute, we found ourselves back in the armchairs by the fire. He had a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the small table between us. He poured a generous amount into each glass and handed one to me. "For medicinal purposes," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. The whiskey was smooth and warm, a welcome fire in my belly that chased away some of the nervous chill. We drank in silence for a while, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the logs in the stove. The charged quiet that had fallen in the kitchen had followed us, draping itself over the room like a heavy blanket. "You're very quiet," he said, breaking the silence. It wasn't an accusation. It was just an observation. I took a sip of whiskey, the liquid courage bolstering me. "It's my default setting," he chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "I'm not. My default setting is loud." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze distant. "My ex-wife used to say I took up too much space. Made too much noise," the words hung in the air. Ex-wife. It was a piece of his history I hadn't known, a door slightly ajar into a past I couldn't have imagined. It humanized him in a way that was both comforting and painful. It meant he had loved someone, built a life with someone. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was the only thing to say. He shrugged, but his shoulders were tight. "It was a long time ago. We were kids. We wanted different things. She wanted the city, parties, people. I wanted this." He gestured vaguely at the dark windows, at the wilderness beyond. The quiet, the irony was so thick I could taste it. "You wanted the quiet?" "Yeah," he said, meeting my eyes over the rim of his glass. "I make a lot of noise when I'm working. But when the work is done, I like the peace. It's just it gets lonely. The quiet gets loud, you know?" And in that moment, I understood him. It was a gut punch of recognition. The confident, self-assured man I had watched from my window was just as lonely as I was. His fortress was built of noise and work, mine of silence and books. But they were fortresses all the same, and we were both prisoners inside. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know, the admission felt like stripping a layer of skin. It was the truest thing I had said to another human being in years. He held my gaze, his eyes dark and intense in the firelight. I used to watch you, he confessed, his voice dropping lower. From my yard, I'd see you in your window, surrounded by all those books. You always looked so content, so complete, like you didn't need anything or anyone. It was a facade, I admitted, the whiskey loosening my tongue. It's easy to look complete when you never let anyone get close enough to see the missing pieces. A long silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. The air was thin, precious. I felt dizzy with the honesty of it all. Elias, he said, and the sound of my own name on his lips was a shock, a caress. I realized I'd never heard him say it before. Why did you move out here? I thought about the real reasons. The bad breakup, the academic burnout, the feeling of being an alien in my own life. I needed a place where the world couldn't find me, I said. Did it work? He asked softly. I looked at him, at this man who had crashed into my life with the force of a fallen tree, who had breached my walls and tended to my wounds, both literal and figurative. It did, I said. Until the world moved in next door, his expression softened. He put his glass down and leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. The space between our chairs shrank. Was that such a bad thing? My heart was a drum against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. I could feel the pull between us, a tangible force like gravity. This was it, the precipice. I could retreat back into my fortress, or I could take a step into the terrifying, unknown territory that was opening up before me. No, I whispered, the word feeling monumental. It wasn't a bad thing. He moved then. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He rose from his chair and closed the small distance between us, kneeling on the floor in front of my armchair. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He smelled of whiskey and wood smoke. He reached out, not to my hand this time, but to my face. His calloused thumb brushed against my cheek, a touch so gentle it made me want to cry. His gaze searched mine, asking a question I was too terrified to answer and too desperate to deny. Elias, he said again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And I leaned in. I closed the final inch between us. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't a collision. It was a discovery. His lips were firm, warm, tasting of whiskey. It was slow, hesitant at first, a question asked and answered in the same breath. It was a moment of profound, earth-shattering quiet in the center of my noisy soul. I brought my hand up to cup the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape. He made a low sound in his throat, a sound of surrender, and deepened the kiss. It was everything I had ever been afraid of, and everything I had ever wanted. It was the end of my carefully curated solitude. It was the beginning of something else, something real. The next morning, I woke with a start. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above me, throwing me off. Then all came rushing back. The storm, the fallen tree, the whiskey, the kiss. I was in the guest bed, alone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over me. I sat up, my heart beginning its familiar, anxious tattoo against my ribs. The house was silent, too silent. The reassuring rumble of the generator was gone. The fire in the stove had died out, leaving a chill in the air. I swung my legs out of bed and pulled on my clothes from the day before. They felt strange, foreign. I felt strange and foreign in my own skin. I tiptoed out of the room, my socked feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The main room was empty. The whiskey glasses were gone from the table by the armchairs. The bottle was gone. It was as if last night had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and alcohol. My stomach twisted into a knot of pure, unadulterated panic. He regrets it. It was a mistake. He's pretending it never happened. The thoughts were a vicious, repeating litany in my head. I felt like a fool, a naive, lonely fool who had mistaken a moment of shared vulnerability for something more. I saw a note on the kitchen counter. My hand trembled as I picked it up. His handwriting was a strong, masculine scrawl, all sharp angles and efficiency. Went to town for supplies. Help yourself to coffee. That was it. No mention of last night. No, we need to talk. Just a practical, impersonal note. It was a dismissal, a cold, hard slap of reality. The intimacy we had shared had been erased by the stark light of day. I couldn't stay. I couldn't face him, couldn't bear to see the pity, or, worse, the awkward regret in his eyes. My own house, damaged as it was, felt like the only sanctuary I had left. I scribbled a hasty note of my own, a pathetic-sounding thank you for his help, and left it on the counter. I grabbed my bag and slipped out of his house, the quiet click of the door behind me sounding like a final, damning judgment. The walk back to my cabin was a walk of shame. The air was crisp and clear, the world scrubbed clean by the storm, but all I felt was a grimy film of self-loathing. The fallen oak was still there, a massive, accusing finger pointed at my broken roof. A blue tarp had been expertly secured over the hole, a testament to Cole's competence and a stark reminder of my dependence on him. My house was cold and smelled of damp plaster. The power was still out. My solitude, once a choice, now felt like a life sentence. I sat in my study, surrounded by my books, my silent companions, and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The silence I had once cultivated now mocked me. It was no longer peaceful. It was just empty. It was an absence. It was the shape of Cole. Days passed. A full week. The power came back on. A crew of men arrived to begin the slow, loud work of removing the tree and repairing my roof. I saw Cole's truck come and go. I saw him in his yard. We were back to our old distance, 100 yards of grass and a universe of unspoken words between us. But it was different now. The distance was no longer a neutral fact. It was a wound. Every time I saw him, my chest ached with a physical intensity that surprised me. I replayed our conversation, the kiss, over and over in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed for the exact moment I had so spectacularly misread everything. My work suffered. The words wouldn't come. The pages remained blank. How could I write about the human condition when I so fundamentally misunderstood my own? I was a fraud, an expert in theories and an amateur in life. The loneliness was a physical weight now. It pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. My fortress had become my prison, and I had been the one to lock the door, both coming and going. I had run from his house from the possibility of rejection, and in doing so, I had guaranteed it. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the storm, I was sitting in my living room, staring at the patch on my ceiling, a pale scar against the old wood. I was nursing a glass of wine, trying to find solace in the familiar ritual, when a knock came at my door. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the same solid, insistent knock as the night of the storm. For a moment, I considered not answering. I could pretend I wasn't home. I could let the opportunity, whatever it was, pass me by. I could retreat back into the safety of my misery. It was the easy choice, the familiar choice. But something in me, a small, stubborn flicker of the hope I thought had been extinguished, rebelled. I was so tired of being afraid. I opened the door. It was him. He stood on my doorstep, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, his shoulders tense. He looked uncertain. The easy confidence that I had always associated with him was gone. He looked as lost and vulnerable as I felt. "Hi," he said, his voice quiet. "Hi." I managed to reply. An awkward silence fell between us. He wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Can I come in?" he asked finally. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked past me into the living room, the familiar scent of sawdust and him filling my space, displacing the stale air of my self-pity. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around at my books, at the neat, sterile order of my life. "You left," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, but it was heavy with hurt. "Your note." I began, my voice trailing off. "It was brief. I thought." "I know," he interrupted, finally turning to face me. His eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. I'm an idiot. I don't. I'm not good with this stuff, Elias. Words. Feelings. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep water. I woke up that morning, and you were there, asleep in my guest room, and I just panicked. It felt too real. Too fast. Everything I thought I wanted was suddenly right there, and it scared the hell out of me. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. So I did what I always do. I ran. I went to town. I made myself busy. I tried to pretend it was just a weird thing that happened because of the storm. Because that's easier than admitting that kissing you was the most honest thing I've done in 10 years, my breath hitched. My carefully constructed narrative of rejection and foolishness shattered into a million pieces. He hadn't been pushing me away because he regretted it. He had been pulling away because he was just as scared as I was. When I got back, he continued, his voice low and earnest. You were gone. You know, I thought you were the one who regretted it. I thought I'd scared you off. That I was too much, too loud. That I'd broken into your quiet life and messed it all up. No, I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. I took a step toward him, closing the distance between us. Cole, no. I left because I was scared. I thought I had imagined it all. I thought I was just another problem for you to fix, like my roof. A small, sad smile touched his lips. You're a problem, he said softly. You're the problem I didn't know I had, and now I can't figure out how to solve it. Maybe it's not a problem to be solved, I whispered, now standing directly in front of him. Maybe it's just something to be. He looked down at me, his gaze searching my face. I've been miserable for the last 2 weeks, he confessed. My house is too quiet. Mine too, I admitted. He reached out then, his hand hesitating for a moment before cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was the same gentle touch as before, but this time there was no uncertainty in it. It was a claim, a promise. I don't want to be quiet anymore, he said. Not like that. Me neither, I breathed. And then he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of relief, of recognition. It was a homecoming. It was the end of the silence, the real silence, the one we had both been living in for far too long. In the weeks that followed, we began to build something new. It was a slow, careful process like learning a new language. We started with dinners, sometimes at his place, sometimes at mine. We talked for hours, filling in the vast, empty spaces that had existed between us. I learned about his childhood in Montana, his failed marriage, his dream of building custom furniture. He learned about my academic career, my passion for obscure poets, my deep-seated fear of failure. We were an unlikely pair, the carpenter and the professor, the man of action and the man of words. But in the quiet moments, we found a common ground, a shared language of touch and understanding that transcended our differences. One Saturday, he was working in his yard, and I was reading on my porch. It was a comfortable, domestic scene that would have been unimaginable just a few months prior. He called my name, and I looked up. He was holding something in his hand. He walked over to my porch and held it out to me. It was a key, a simple, brass key. What's this for? I asked, though my heart already knew. It's for my house, he said, his gaze steady and clear. Just in case of another storm. Or in case you just want to be there. It was more than a key. It was an invitation, an act of trust. It was a tangible symbol that the space between us was no longer a barrier, but a bridge. I took it from his palm, my fingers closing around the cool metal. I have one for you, too, I said, a smile spreading across my face. I went inside and retrieved the spare key to my own cabin. I placed it in his hand, just in case you need a quiet place to read. He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that made my chest feel warm and full. He pocketed the key and pulled me into his arms, right there on my front porch in the full light of day. He kissed me, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and promise. It wasn't a secret whispered in the dark anymore. It was a statement. Our lives began to merge, slowly, naturally. My books started appearing on his shelves, next to his woodworking manuals. His coffee maker found a permanent home on my kitchen counter because he insisted mine was a disgrace to the bean. We fell into a rhythm, a shared routine that was 1,000 times more comforting than my old, solitary one. Now, My mornings start not with silence, but with the sound of his steady breathing beside me. We make coffee together, our movements a familiar, easy dance in the small space of the kitchen. Some nights, I read to him while he sketches out a new design for a table or a chair, his hand occasionally reaching out to rest on my leg, a simple, grounding touch. My fortress of solitude didn't fall. It just grew. It expanded to include him, its walls becoming windows, letting in the light. The quiet I once craved is still here, but it's no longer an emptiness. It's a peaceful, shared space, filled with the comfortable presence of the person I love. Cole wasn't a disruption in my life. He was an awakening. The storm that brought him crashing into my world didn't destroy my sanctuary. It washed away the dust, cleared out the shadows, and showed me what I had truly been missing. It wasn't solitude I had been seeking. It was a connection so deep that it didn't require words. It was a quiet I could share, and I found it in the arms of the loudest man I had ever known. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the beautiful, unexpected chapter that turned my story into a love song.